After the first episode of our John Paul II, The Quintessence series, the lecture that guided us through the early years of Karol Wojtyła's life, pointing to the formative figures and experiences that shaped him as a young man and leading up to his ordination for priesthood. It is my pleasure to invite you to the second lecture, which will explore the crucial events and subjects for Karol Wojtyła as a priest and shepherd of young believers, as a philosopher, theologian, and university professor, as a bishop, and finally, as cardinal. It can be said that the essence of this period of his life and work was his focus on and his deep understanding of the indispensable God-given dignity of the human person. The lecture has been produced by the St. Nicholas Foundation and the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, and would not have been possible without the support of our donors, whom I hereby would like to cordially thank. To check out our other projects and studies, please go to our website, Angelicum IT, and click on the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture. I am honored to leave you with Professor George Weigel and his second lecture, titled Karol Wojtyła, Christian Humanism in Defense of Human Dignity. Dear George, floor is yours.
Karol Wojtyła was ordained to the priesthood of the Catholic Church on November 1st, 1946, in the chapel of the Archbishop's residence in Kraków. The Archbishop, Adam Stefan Sapieha, had been named a cardinal by Pope Pius XII in one of the first consistories, after the Second World War, and immediately took the decision to send young Father Wojtyła to Rome to do a doctorate in theology at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is known as the Angelicum, St. Thomas Aquinas being the angelic doctor. Cardinal Sapieha told young Father Wojtyła that he was to learn Rome and learn Europe, as well as take the required courses and write his doctoral dissertation, which he did on faith in St. John of the Cross, St. John of the Cross idea of faith. Rome in 1946, 47, 48 was a very different place than it is today, far less busy, very easy to walk around, learn the city. Wojtyła also took the occasion of being in Europe for 2 years to explore other corners of the continent, including a trip to France and Belgium, where he observed an experiment being conducted in those countries called the Catholic worker priest. Priests who would go into industrial factories and work as laborers in order to evangelize men who were, in the main, joining communist labor unions. One of Wojtyła's professors at the Angelicum was Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, a neo-Thomist, sometimes called the sacred monster of Thomism, a very influential theologian of the time who taught a rather stolid form of theology, almost theology as logic, theology as syllogism. Father Wojtyła respected Father Garrigou-Lagrange, particularly impressed by his seminars on the theology of the priesthood and on mysticism, but Garrigou-Lagrange's neo-Thomistic stiffness, if you will, seemed to Wojtyła something that would not be particularly helpful in the post-World War II Catholic world. In 1948, having earned his doctoral degree, Wojtyła came back to the Archdiocese of Krakow. Cardinal Sapieha assigned him to a country parish for a few months, perhaps to fatten him up a bit because he was very, very thin on his return from Rome. And then came 2 years, which were fundamental not only for Karol Wojtyła, but would have a profound effect on the life of the Catholic Church throughout the world 40, 50, 60 years later. Cardinal Sapieha assigned Father Wojtyła to the parish of St. Florian, just north of the Krakow Old City. St. Florian's was a parish attended by many Krakowian Catholic intellectuals, and it was a parish situated in the midst of a great number of institutions of higher education. The Krakow Academy of Fine Arts, the Krakow Polytechnic. There were student dormitories all over the neighborhood. And Cardinal Sapieha wanted young Father Wojtyła to initiate a new campus ministry, if you will, to the students at these institutions. This was not simple at all. Organized Catholic youth activities were banned by the communist authorities then in charge of Poland. So Father Wojtyła had to literally go out and gather his congregation, form his youth ministry person by person, dorm room by dorm room, inviting young men and women to meet him at the parish, forming some of them into a choir, which he taught the rudiments of Gregorian chant so they could sing at Mass rather than simply watching the priest celebrate Mass. And out of this original group of Wojtyła students grew what would eventually become a 3-generational network of friends, lay friends, of Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, that called itself Środowisko, milieu, environment. These were some of Karol Wojtyła's closest friends throughout virtually his entire adult life. And as he was forming these young men and women into mature Christians, helping them as they got married, formed families, they were forming him into one of the most dynamic priests of his generation. 50 years later, 40 years later, as Pope, John Paul II would create something quite new in the history of the Catholic Church called World Youth Days, a triennial Catholic youth festival built around the presence of the Pope, at which young men and women would learn the faith, experience the beauty of Christian community together, receive the sacraments together, the beginnings of World Youth Day, which is now a regular part of the rhythm of Catholic life throughout the world, go back to that parish of St. Florian and the young men and women whom Karol Wojtyła was forming into mature Christians. In doing so, he was creating zones of freedom in a stultifying communist environment in which speaking the truth in public was dangerous and perhaps even lethal. So Wojtyła would take his young people out into the country on skiing trips, on hiking trips, later on kayaking trips around the rivers and lakes of Poland. This was completely unheard of for a Polish priest at the time. Even more unheard of was his celebrating the Mass with an overturned kayak as his altar. Out of this experience of working so intensely with young adults and young families, Wojtyła developed the conviction that sanctity, holiness, was every Christian's baptismal calling. Sanctity was not simply for the sanctuary of the church. The task of the Christian was to sanctify all of life, including daily life, including the life of work, family life, recreational life. All of this was to be sanctified. Why? Because Catholic faith embraces all of life and should touch all of life. Catholic faith is not simply a lifestyle choice. What do I do on Sunday mornings? Catholic faith teaches us that everything is to be sanctified. After some years as a full-time campus minister, as we would say today, Wojtyła was commissioned by the Archbishop of Krakow to write a second doctoral dissertation, which would qualify him as a university professor. So he moved from the parish of St. Florian to a house on Canonicia Street, the Canons Street, near Wawel Castle and Cathedral, where he spent 2 years writing a second doctoral dissertation, the so-called habilitation thesis, on the philosophy of a German phenomenologist named Max Scheler. Wojtyła was already looking for new and creative ways in order to make enduring Christian truths make sense in the modern world. The Scheler dissertation was one example of that. After he completed that work, he was invited to begin teaching on a part-time basis at the Catholic University of Lublin in the east of Poland. The Catholic University of Lublin was a completely unique institution. It was, as one of Wojtyła's colleagues would put it to me years later, the only place between Berlin and Vladivostok, 14 time zones, where philosophy was free. It was the only Catholic institution of higher learning in the communist world, and at that utterly unique institution in a quaint medieval town, the philosophers on the faculty, including Wojtyła, set themselves a very large project. How do we get philosophy on a firm intellectual foundation? Philosophy over the previous 200, perhaps even 300 years, had risked becoming thinking about thinking rather than thinking about the truth of things. The Lublin philosophers believed that the human mind, reason, could get to the truth of things through a disciplined exercise of reason, but it had to be done, if you will, from the bottom up rather than from the top down. Classical philosophy, Aristotle, for example, had begun with cosmology and eventually worked its way down to thinking about the human person and how we should live. Lublin philosophers, at the center of which was Wojtyła and his work, believed that you had to do it in a different way. You had to start with the human person and build up from there. During those Lublin years, Wojtyła taught the basic undergraduate course in philosophical ethics, but he also taught a graduate course in which he and his master's degree students and doctoral degree students would do a close reading of a particular philosopher or philosophers. And one of those courses in the late 1950s was particularly interesting because Wojtyła and his students spent almost an entire academic year reading the British utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was certainly not a major figure in Polish philosophical circles at the time. So why were they reading Jeremy Bentham? I think even at that early stage of his life, Wojtyła understood that the communist project was doomed. It had such a false idea of who we are as human beings, where we came from, what our nature is, what our destiny is, that it would inevitably fail. And its false view of the human person was what made it such a horrible system politically. Why read Bentham? Because the next challenge to the dignity of the human person, which Wojtyła, during the experience of the Second World War, had committed himself to defending, the next challenge to the dignity of the human person was going to come from utilitarianism. The reduction of the human person to categories of you're useless or you're useful. This was another degradation that needed to be challenged, and Wojtyła wanted to get to the roots of it. In 1958, at the very young age of 38, Karol Wojtyła was named an auxiliary or assistant bishop of Krakow by Pope Pius XII in one of the last acts of his pontificate, and was ordained a bishop in Wawel Cathedral on September 22, 1958. Just a few years later, indeed just a year later, the Pope who was elected in October 1958, Pope John XXIII, would make a decisive intervention in Karol Wojtyła's life and indeed the life of the Catholic Church throughout the world by announcing on January 25th, 1959, that he was going to summon the 21st Ecumenical Council, a gathering of all the world's bishops in the history of the Catholic Church. It would meet in Rome beginning in 1962. After the Pope had made that announcement, a commission was formed in the Vatican to prepare the agenda for this enormous meeting, which would eventually become the largest legislative body in human history, 2,500 voting members of the council. That commission wrote a letter to all of the bishops of the world saying, Pope has decided to have this council, bring all of you gentlemen together. What would you like to talk about? Wojtyła's response to that is one of the most striking documents in the 8 volumes of answers that came in to the commission's question. Many bishops throughout the world sent in laundry lists of particular things they wanted changed in the church's legal system, in the church's way of worship, in the relationship between local bishops and the Vatican. Wojtyła did not send in a laundry list. He sent in a philosophical essay in the form of a letter that began with the question, what happened? A 20th century that had begun with great hopes for a maturing humanity, tutored by science, achieving new heights of prosperity and freedom. Within 50 years, those hopes had been completely dashed by 2 world wars, 3 totalitarian systems, oceans of blood, mountains of corpses, the Gulag, the Holocaust of European Jewry, the Ukrainian Holodomor, and the greatest persecution of the church in history. What happened? And Wojtyła suggests an answer. What happened to produce all of that immense suffering was that the idea of the human person in the high culture of the Western world had gone astray, had gone off the rails. Defective ideas of who we are, where we come from, how we should live together, what our destiny is, had created Italian fascism, German National Socialism, Marxism-Leninism, the Bolshevik experiment. All of these awful things, at bottom, were based on defective ideas of the human person. Therefore, Wojtyła wrote, the Council should rescue the project of Western humanism by offering Jesus Christ, true God and true man, as he who reveals both the truth about God and the truth about us. Christian humanism, the Christian view of the human person, created by God for communion with God, destined for eternal life. All of that manifest in Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified and risen Lord. That was the answer, Wojtyła suggested in this 1960 letter, to the false humanisms that had made such a disastrous mess of the first half of the 20th century. Interestingly enough, that was John XXIII's idea for the Second Vatican Council as well, as he made clear in his opening address to the Council on October 11th, 1962, when he said that the purpose of the Council was not to reinvent the Catholic Church. The Council had no authority to do that. Christ had invented the Church. The purpose of the Council was to find ways to make Christ's proclamation of the truth about who we are and where we are headed more accessible to the people of the late 21st century, the late 20th century, and eventually the 21st century. Karol Wojtyła, first as Auxiliary Bishop of Krakow, later as the Archbishop of Krakow, attended all 4 periods of the Second Vatican Council. In the fall months of 1962, 63, 64, and 65. That was another formative, even defining experience for him. He once said it was his second graduate education in theology. It put him in touch with Catholic thinkers from all over the world. Perhaps even more importantly, it exposed him in a way that he had not been exposed before, except in those 2 years in Rome in 46 to 48, to the universality of the Church. He was particularly struck by the vitality, the freshness of the new churches of Africa. With the possible exception of a few classmates at the Angelicum in 1946 to 1948, Karol Wojtyła didn't know Africa, and he didn't know Africans. He was mesmerized by these people who were often first or second generation Christians, bishops who had baptized their parents after they had become the first Christian in their parish. And out of that experience, Wojtyła got an idea of the immense vitality of the Catholic Church, even in the late modern world. In 1964, after a lengthy negotiation between the Primate of Poland, Cardinal Wyszynski, and the communist authorities of Poland, Karol Wojtyła was named the Archbishop of Krakow. And at the 1964 and 1965 periods of the Council, his work intensified at Vatican II. He was an important figure in shaping the Council's declaration on religious freedom, interestingly enough, with the title Dignitatis Humanae, human dignity, insisting that while every human person has a right to seek the truth, that right has to be exercised in seeking the truth and adhering to it when you found it. Religious freedom was not simply a free-floating faculty of choice. It was a right attached to a responsibility. Find the truth and adhere to it. Even more importantly, Wojtyła was instrumental in shaping in its final form what is known as the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, into which he inserted two ideas that he had been pondering for perhaps 20 years, maybe more at that point. In paragraph 22 of the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, the Council teaches, in words that I believe absolutely reflected Wojtyła's thinking and may have been written by him, that in the incarnate Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, crucified and risen, we meet both the truth about God, the merciful Father, and we meet the truth about us. Jesus reveals humanity as humanity ought to be. Secondly, in paragraph 24 of the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, the Council teaches, again in words that may well have been crafted by Archbishop Wojtyła, that we find the meaning of our lives, the road, the pathway to happiness, in making our lives a gift for others, as each of our lives is a gift to us. None of us is the cause of our own existence. That was, for Karol Wojtyła, not simply a biological fact. It was a metaphysical fact. It was something that revealed something deep in the human condition. And it was a moral fact. It told us how we ought to live. Council ended on December 8, 1965. Wojtyła returned to Krakow after assisting Cardinal Wyszynski at the end of the council in effecting a reconciliation, a profound Christian reconciliation between the churches of Germany and Poland. Wojtyła comes back to Krakow, and between 1967 and 1978, he undertakes what was arguably the most intense implementation of Vatican II in any diocese in the world. A 9-year process of reflection, prayer, and only after reflection on the council documents and prayer, implementation of the teaching of the council. In those years, 67 to 78, Wojtyła became an even larger figure in the World Church. He participated in all the meetings of the World Synod of Bishops. He was named a cardinal by Pope Paul VI in 1967. He wrote his major philosophical work, Person and Act, in those years, attempting to, again, put philosophical ethics, philosophical anthropology, the philosophical exploration of who we are and how we should live in order to attain the happiness we seek, on a firm basis. It was also during those years that Karol Wojtyła grew into the role, traditional to the archbishops of Krakow, of being the defensor civitatis, the defender of the city, its citizens, and their rights. This struggle for space for religious conviction in communist-dominated Poland found its symbolic center in Wojtyła's decade-long attempt, finally successful, to build a church in the new town of Nowa Huta on the eastern side of Krakow, east of Krakow, which was the first human settlement in Polish history deliberately planned without a church. For 10 years, Wojtyła fought the communist authorities to build a church in Nowa Huta and finally succeeded in building a magnificent contemporary structure called the Ark of Our Lady and Our Lord in Nowa Huta and dedicating it in 1977. On October 16, 1978, The Archbishop of Krakow, Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, was elected the Bishop of Rome, the Pope of the Catholic Church. This was an enormous shock to much of the world, certainly to much of the Church. There hadn't been a non-Italian Pope in 455 years. There had never been a Slavic Pope before. Why did that happen? Why did this man from a far country, as he described himself to the crowds in St. Peter's Square on the night of his election, why was he elected Pope? He was, as I said a moment ago, one of the most well-known figures in the Catholic world to the men who were electing the Pope. But it was also because of a personal quality that was best described by one of the men with whom he had worked at the Second Vatican Council, the French Dominican theologian Yves Congar. Congar kept a very thick diary of the Second Vatican Council, and in it, he reflected upon a meeting in January 1965 to prepare the final draft of the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, at which Archbishop Wojtyła was present. Here's what Congar wrote in his diary about Wojtyła. He has a magnetic power, a prophetic strength, full of peace and impossible to resist. That personal quality of a radically converted Christian disciple who was both very, very intelligent, full of the joy of the Lord, and a shrewd observer of the human scene, made Karol Wojtyła irresistible to the men electing a pope in October 1978. And out of that election came what is arguably the most important pontificate, the most important papacy in the second half of the second millennium.